believe that this is a very important session for you. It's about financial resources. It has two parts. With the first part, we are going to talk about financing sources, and our bodies is voluntary. Well, he works for Roots to Justice, and he has sought and searched for companies that finance grassroots communities, and there are some questions that I would like to ask him. After Borislav's presentation will be about around 15 minutes. We will give access to Maurice Blackburn. This is a legal firm, Oscar and Mickey. They a strategic litigation fund, which is they are they're partners to Roots to Justice, and they are going to explain a little bit criterion on how to finance strategic litigation. So, with no further ado, I will begin to talk to Borislav. Buenas tardes.
Mira. ¿Me escuchas bien? Muy bien, sí, sí, te escucho muy bien. Gracias. Ok. Voy a hablar con él en inglés.
I'm going
¿vale?
to speak. We have a translation, interpretation.
So, can you tell us a little bit about recording in progress? Some of the key features of the funding scheme and the key players that you think are most important and relevant for work on the issues that we are considering here in this forum.
Thank you, Susie, and very nice to be with all of you, even if my Spanish is not good enough to make this presentation in Spanish. So there are a couple of key elements of the overall picture of the philanthropic environment. Basically, there are three different categories of sources, all with different sources of money, different ways of operating, different caliber of staff. And it's very important when trying to find funding to be kind of clear about the differences between them. So the first one is big private foundations. Some are more traditional and some have existed for 40 or 50 years, and there's some new ones. And what's characteristic for them is that they have their own money, which come usually from investments in the stock market. They have small staff, large grants, and they work on a given issue for a very long time. But at the same time, for many of them, it's difficult to access them directly. The second category is governmental agencies, embassies, intergovernmental development agencies. What's important to have in mind here is that there is some government policy behind it and government money, which is at the same time quite large sometimes, but also has lots of small conditions attached to it. Stuff there, unlike in the private foundations, changes quite often. Government policies change quite often with changes of government, but they are actually disbursing a lot more funds than the private foundations taken together. And finally, the community-based or intermediate organizations, and there are many of them working. There are about maybe 15 to 20. I heard the previous presentation, people mentioned some of them. So they're very focused on a particular community or a particular issue or a country. They're much easier and quicker to deal with. The amounts of money that they disburse is much smaller than the previous two, but it's easy to access them and they're very quick, and their staff is very knowledgeable both about the communities and the issues. And I have found three that are particularly relevant to the work that you're doing, and I will be happy to say a bit more about all of them later.
Borislav, thanks very much. Can you also share any particular insights or understandings about funding that you want to share with our participants, which might be helpful when they approach donors?
Yeah, I think there's this a particular field with a particular jargon and ways of working, and I think that I want to share with you 6 particularities of that field. One is that every one of these institutions has some kind of strategy. Sometimes it's publicly available, sometimes it's very long, sometimes it's too long to read. But whether it's shared or not, all the grant making that they're doing follows some approved strategy. Sometimes it's more stable and changes and so on. And frequently, what's made public is very general, saying make the world a better place. So it's very important to try and find out what's really the strategy, the internal documents, and they have limitations about geographies, issues, types of organizations, and so on. Number 2 is to know where the money comes from, because different types of money come with different conditions. Obviously, you want to have as little conditions as possible and as much freedom as possible. But every donor has both obvious and sometimes not so obvious conditions. And it's very important to find out what these conditions are about access, what you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do, how much they might interfere with what you do. The third is the decision making. I mean, there's some donors that are very quick, but that's an exception. I would say the decision making is fairly slow. So approach donors at least 6 months before the money will be needed, and if possible, for a longer period in advance. The fourth is the attitude to litigation, and one can say a lot about it, but not every donor funds litigation. And actually, it's very rare that litigation is kind of announced as one of the areas. The best strategy I think I have found that people have used is bundle litigation together in a larger advocacy project, maybe together with awareness raising and training and political and legal advocacy. But there's some that fund litigation. And the big difference here is whether it's strategic litigation, like long-term, complicated, large cases trying to change laws and practices in some big way, or whether, for lack of a better word, let's say defensive case-based litigation, which is smaller cases. No case is small for the people involved, but in terms of complexity or length or costs. The fifth is the size and length. All the donors have limitations about the size and length of grants. So it's very important to understand in advance what the size and the length that they can give you is. And finally, and it's final in the list, but it's probably not final in importance, is the ease of access to the donors. And that's really a big issue with the donor community. And the key difference here is whether you can apply directly to them or not, and whether you need partners from other countries or not. But these are the 6 key considerations, I think, that are important to have in mind when approaching one of these 3 categories of donors. And I'm not speaking about litigation funders here, which would be a separate chapter in our conversation.
Great.
Susie.
Thanks very much, Borislav. So the next question would be, what are some of the areas of corporate accountability related work that donors seem to prioritize now?
Well, every donor has kind of a different word or types of words, but I think I have identified maybe 6 of those areas. So it's important when you approach a donor to link what you're trying to do with one of them. The first is corporate capture. That's not really used by the intergovernmental or multilateral donors, but there are quite a few activist private donors that are working on corporate capture. The second is, how shall I put it? kind of generally speaking, issues of business regulations, supply chains, due diligence, and so on. The third is labor rights and modern slavery. The fourth is environment and environmental defenders. The fifth is business complicity in government abuses, in dictatorship, civil war, armed conflict, and in the context of transitional justice. And the sixth is indigenous rights. And many actually cover more than one area. And so it's really important to understand in the mindset of the donor how they see what they're funding and what language they're using. But those are the six main categories, I think.
Thanks very much. And finally, what could be some of the opportunities to fund litigation on corporate accountability for grassroots organizations in Colombia right now?
So I want to share with you three examples. There might be others, and with further research, we might be able to find others. The first is the SAGE Fund, SAGE, which is one of those intermediary funds. It gets money from the big private donors, I think about 5 or 6 of them, and then distributes these funds to smaller organizations. It's managed from the US, and once a year it has a thematic round. You can actually access it and apply. They announce it on their website. For example, their latest one was on climate justice. Before that, they had a round on remedies for mining disasters. So they're in this area. And what they prefer to do is to support global coalitions that combine multiple tools and many organizations. And there are many examples. They've worked in the land grabbing in Indonesia, gas projects in Mozambique. I think they work in the Dominican Republic. But basically, they're trying to address some big issue through a concerted effort of a large number of organizations. And often that includes quite a large number of smaller organizations. And they're open to, they have requests for proposals, and you can apply for them. The organizations that cannot apply to them are large international NGOs from Europe or America. So they're not the intended recipients. The second is Environmental Defenders Law Center, Centro Legal de Defensores de Medio Ambiente. It's actually managed from Brazil. It's the only one which is focused on litigation. It can provide lawyers, experts, and funding for litigation, for expertise and others. And it provides financing for individual cases. Actually, that's very rare because usually donors want to fund some kind of big campaign with multiple cases, changing the law and so on. This one provides financing for casework, including very small grants, $2,000, $5,000, and so on. And they are not focused on cases of defense of defenders. They fund the cases and not the campaigns. So it's a very, very litigation-focused fund. And they're focused on resource development projects that harm human rights, health, and environments of communities in developing countries. And I've talked with the director, and they would be very happy to consider cases from Colombia. And they're very quick as well. And they've funded around 100 cases since they started. 100 cases in maybe 15 or 16 different countries over the last 15 years since they started. And the final one, unlike the one I just mentioned, is actually focused on cases of protection of environmental defenders. And this is the Environmental Defenders Collective of Global Green Grants Fund. The Global Green Grant Fund is quite large. It's also an intermediary. It's getting money from the private foundations and then distributes them to smaller ones. And for example, in last year, they made more than 150 grants in 30 countries. They're not focused only on litigation, but they can support organizations as such with a fairly large amounts of grants. I think some are up to 50,000. A lot are in the $25,000, $30,000 range. You cannot apply directly to them, but they have a network of 200 advisors around the world who recommend grantees and cases to them, and quite a few of them are in Latin America. Or an organization or a case or a project could be proposed to them by a network of partner organizations, and there were not 10 of those organizations that can recommend smaller partners to them, and those are Accountability Council, Asociación Interamericana para la Defensa del Ambiente, Bank Information Center, Coalition for Human Rights in Development, Earthworks, Environmental Defender Law Center, the one I mentioned before, Environmental Law Alliance Worldwide, Global Climate Legal Defense, Mining Watch Canada, and Rhizome. And I'll end up here, but I think these are the three most likely and accessible sources for the kind of work I suppose you have discussed in your meeting. Susie.
Brilliant, Borislav. Muchísimas gracias. Many thanks. We appreciate the fact that you have spoken to these donors. No sé cómo os suena a vosotros, pero ahí hay una buena oportunidad para aplicar a estas tres fuentes. Nosotros podemos ayudar en el seguimiento, quizás transcribiendo parte de este vídeo para que ustedes tengan toda la información, porque hay mucho detalle. Nosotros tenemos contacto con Global Green Grants, con lo cual también ahí podríamos ser una entrada hacia esa organización. Bien, vamos a continuar. Vamos a hacer las preguntas después. Es que tenemos un ejercicio planeado para hacer un diálogo con los ponentes. I'm going to now give the floor to Maurice Blackburn. I think it's Oscar first and then Nikki, or the other way around, sorry.
Me first.
Nikki first, okay.
Thanks, Susie. And apologies for not being able to speak in Spanish either. I think my Spanish is not even as good as Borislav's. So it's lovely to be here with you all your evening. And thank you. I know you've had a really packed 3 days and we're at the very end of your 3 days. So thank you for bearing with us and listening. So as Susie mentioned, my name is Nikki Lees. I work at a place called Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. We're an Australian law firm and we're a social justice law firm. So in terms of my background, I've run strategic human rights litigation, including lots of cases against different companies for around 10 years. I also work in our claims funding practice, funding international litigation against large companies that cause damage and harm. So for example, against local environments or local communities. So Borislav spoke about resourcing in terms of finding grants to run litigation and the key challenges or opportunities around this. So I'm going to talk about some things to think about when assessing your resourcing needs and things that you need to keep in mind when you're applying for grants or funding and making sure that actually what you get covers your needs in the life of the case. I'm then going to flick to Oscar, and he's going to talk about engaging an international litigation funder if you have a particular type of case where you need to match the resources of a large corporate defendant. So I'll just speak for 5-10 minutes about how you properly assess your resourcing needs. So basically, when applying for any type of funding, it's really important to consider right from the start the resources you'll need for the entirety or the whole life of your case. It's really important that any funding or grant application actually gives you what you need and you don't end up a year down the track without, the resources that you need to continue. So we'll look at that in a couple of different phases of a case. So if we start with pre-litigation or the investigation phase of a case and think about how to assess your resourcing needs around this. So I'm sure we all know that this can be a really resource-intensive part to run. There's lots of different things to consider. So community consultation processes, travel costs, and you can actually apply to have your travel costs covered in this stage of the case. And think about the resources that you need to even collect the evidence to be able to issue the case. One thing that I've found in my practice that can be really expensive and needs to be factored in is the pre-litigation things such as soil testing, water testing, if you're looking at an environmental damage case, for example, and then even engaging a preliminary expert opinion to look at these results and tell you what you should do with them. The other thing to think about from the very start in terms of assessing your resourcing needs is the amount of work you have to do to follow the corporate trail. So linking actions between a parent company and a subsidiary, what jurisdiction you should bring the case in, really getting to the bottom of these questions takes a lot of your time and should be factored into any kind of grant application, funding application, and assessing your needs. So a couple of useful tips about how to reduce your resourcing costs for the above. One thing that actually Susie got or introduced us to, which I think is a fascinating organisation, is SOMO, the Centre for Research on Multinational Corporations. This is a Dutch organisation that can provide local lawyers around the world with the assistance you need in research, in doing that research around corporate structures and other company information. So Routes to Justice is able to facilitate that connection if it's needed and appropriate, but they can really help in what I was talking about before around that really intensive research needed to follow the corporate trail and find who you should sue at the end of the day. Another really interesting resource that can help reduce the costs or get you over the line with collecting evidence to know if you should bring your case is actually thinking about how to use apps. So there's a really interesting app called the Eyewitness app. Now, this one was developed by the International Bar Association, but there are a whole heap of other similar apps being developed that you can look at online. And basically, this is an app on your phone where if you think that there's a human rights abuse happening, there's environmental damage, individuals can use that app to document what they see in their local communities. And then the app company partners with the lawyers running the case, and that can become evidence that you need in your case. And it's a really interesting way and new and innovative way to try to collect evidence and support your own work in doing that. And it actually allows you to, again, bring down that cost of trying to travel there yourself and collect all this evidence yourself. So in terms of moving on to the litigation phase, as we know, our own time, our professional costs can go into a request for grants or funding. But this is an issue that I often run into as well in my own practice, but thinking about, well, what actually does your time include in the life of a case? And your staff's time, your other employees' time. And there's a few different factors to consider. So we know that in corporate accountability cases, companies fight these cases hard. I haven't run a case in this space where they're not fought tooth and nail. So thinking about things from the start in terms of interlocutory applications, strikeout applications, and any security for costs applications as well. As I said, I've just recently run a case that went for 6 years, and half the thing was interlocutory applications from the company in question. Then we think about the discovery process, and we know again that large companies like to drown applicants in documents. So again, thinking from the start, what resources you need for paralegal assistance, for document review, and factoring all those into any kind of resourcing assessment. There's obviously expert reports, domestic and international experts that you might want to call on. These can be really expensive. So one tip in this area is thinking about how you can best rely on or use amicus briefs in your litigation. So amicus briefs can be a really useful way for interested international or local NGOs to contribute to your case. So as we know, That's amicus briefs are factual information or legal insights, which are submitted to the court by people or organisations who are not party to the case, but are interested in the overall result. One thing that I came across in the region that I thought looked really interesting was that the Centre for International Environmental Law have seen partners with a number of local NGOs to put in multiple amicus briefs to support litigation before such bodies as the Inter-American Court for Human Rights. And thinking about how you can maximise external support like that to bolster your case. The final thing is the resolution of the case. And this is a really interesting thing to think about in terms of assessing your resourcing needs. So look, if the case loses, as sometimes it does, thinking from the start about how you can protect your exposure. So grants, so either philanthropic grants or even commercial funding, which Oscar will talk about, can sometimes cover your risk if you do have to pay the other side's costs. And so thinking about how you can set that up from the start to protect yourself. Now, if you win, which is a much more preferable outcome, one of the really interesting things is thinking from the very start of a case about what that process looks like. So if it's a claim for damages or compensation money, thinking about how much time is it going to take to find class members and how much, or your clients, and what community education campaigns do you need to do to let people know about the result and facilitate people getting their money. And all of this should be built into your funding request from the very start of a case and assessing your resourcing needs. So I'll end just with a quick case example of a case that I've just finished running, which was a big learning curve for me in terms of assessing these needs from the very start of a case. So at Maurice Blackburn, we were running a claim for compensation for 1,200 young First Nations kids that had been mistreated in youth detention. So 6 years it took to fight the case. Again, as I mentioned earlier, it was fought at every stage of the way. But look, we settled it for $35 million. We thought, great, the case is done. But what we didn't factor in from the start was how difficult it would be to locate 1,200 young people living really in remote communities in regional Australia. So it took us over 12 months to find all the clients, explain the case, and actually give them their money. So that was something that we didn't properly factor into our cost assessment from the start and had to adjust as we went. So look, that was really, I think, a really big learning for me to think at the very start of a case, what does the resourcing needs look like for those 3 stages of a case, and make sure that actually you're supported before you even start the case in being able to run the whole case through to its entirety of its lifespan. So that's my 2 cents, and I'm going to pass over to Oscar, who's going to talk a bit more about commercial litigation funding.
Many thanks, Nikki. Sorry, Oscar. Oscar, his name is very Latino, but he's not really Latino. He's going to speak in English.
Thank you, Susie. Yes, my Spanish is not very good either. Good evening, good afternoon to all. It's a great privilege to be with you. My background, I work with Nikki at Maurice Blackburn and with Claims Funding International. My background is in class action litigation in Australia, where we get hundreds or thousands of people who have suffered a similar disadvantage from a company or a government, and we bundle their cases together and pursue them at once. And I've also been involved in funding cases in various European countries, in South Africa, in Japan, and in Canada as well. So that's a bit on my background. As Nikki said, I'm going to talk about commercial litigation funding, which is not something that is going to work for every case, but can be very useful for some cases. And in particular, it's cases where that are very complicated and are going to be very costly to run, and cases where the outcome that you want from the case is some compensation in the form of money. So you want damages from a company or a government that has caused harm. And so how the arrangement generally works is that a commercial litigation funder will pay either some or all of the legal costs of bringing a case. They will pay for expert witnesses. They will pay for any studies that need to be undertaken. They will pay for the lawyers to do their work and make sure that they can sustainably work on the case. And what commercial funders ask for in return is that if the case is successful, if damages are awarded, that they will get a percentage of those damages themselves. And so it's the most helpful in those cases that Nikki mentioned, where the tactics of the defendant will be to use all of their resources to delay the case, to throw up obstacles to your efforts, and to try and outspend and outlast whoever is suing them. They really, the litigation funding is at its best when it evens up the playing field, as we say, between the plaintiffs and between the defendants. So I'll just give you an example of one case that we worked on. It was actually one that we worked on as lawyers, but with an external funder, where I think the funding was very, very helpful and led to a terrific outcome. It was a case where there was an oil driller was happening offshore off the coast of Australia, in the waters between Australia and Indonesia, one of our nearest neighbours here. And the oil platform was being run very badly, very negligently, and that resulted in a explosion on the platform and an oil spill that ran for 3 months of just pouring oil into the ocean in a very sensitive and ecologically sensitive area, and no one could stop it for 3 months. Now, the oil company said that there hadn't been much oil, that it had not travelled very far away, and that the environmental impacts were very limited. But what we learned was that in Indonesia, to the north of where this had all happened, about 50,000 villagers who were living and working on the southern coast of one of the islands there had been farming seaweed. And it had actually become quite a helpful crop for them that they had been able to sell, and it had been a key part of their earnings. And their seaweed crops had died off almost immediately when this oil spill happened, with devastating economic consequences and everything that flowed from those economic consequences in those communities. And so it was a very difficult case to approach. We had an oil company that had the best access to what had happened. We had nobody else who was able to say what had happened or what the impacts actually were. And so to run the case, we had to buy satellite imagery from a company that had been keeping photographs of the area at the time. We had to get international experts on oil spills and how they work and how the oil disperses after a spill like that. We had to get international experts to talk about how seaweed crops work under different stresses and how they might have responded to an oil spill like that. We had to have economists go through the villages and identify what the impacts had been of this spill and of the die-off of the seaweed crops. We had to fly all of the witnesses down to Australia to appear in court multiple times. It was just a very expensive, very difficult case to run. And one that we had the help of a litigation funder to run. And as an indication of the costs, it cost tens of millions of dollars to run that case over many years. Now, happily, we eventually won that case. It would not have happened without the support of that litigation funder. There was no way we could run a case that cost tens of millions of dollars without that assistance. And so we think it was a terrific outcome. Now, what happened when we got the result, which was about $180 million, is the funder has taken quite a large portion of that money. And that was the bargain that was done at the beginning of the case. But if we'd lost that case, then they would have lost all of that, and would have also had to pay the other side's costs as well. So it was one of these unusual cases where it could have only happened with funding, and it did work out quite well. And as we speak, there is a boat going around the southern coast of an Indonesian island, going into villages, opening bank accounts for people and depositing money into those accounts. Now, it's not replacing everything that they've lost. It's not going to come close to replacing everything that they've lost, but it's a very meaningful, significant piece of compensation for what's been a devastating outcome for them in that part of the world. So that's sort of how the life of a case can work with litigation funding. If you have a case that you think might work for litigation funding, the things that you need to think about are very similar things to what Nikki was talking about. If you're going to approach a litigation funder, you need to have a very clear idea of what the case is that you want to bring and how you're going to approach it and what it's going to cost. So you don't have to have done all of the work, of course, to work the case up, but you need a clear idea of which court you're going to file in, the sorts of arguments that you're going to bring, the sort of evidence that you're going to need, any experts that you might have to call, and a sense of how much it will cost, a sense of how much you want to claim from that case, and a sense of how long you think it will take. And so that's sort of the starting point for any discussion with a litigation funder. And finally, I suppose it's important to just talk through why litigation funding might not be right for you in your case. And the key point there is that when you get a litigation funder in, you have another party involved in your case. And so usually the litigation funder will have some say in settlement discussions and will be able to give an opinion on whether the case should be settled in a certain way. And so there's, in that sense, you lose a little bit of control of your case, and you have another party having a say in how it gets run. And so I think it's very important in that case to think about who you want to work with as a litigation funder, because there are dozens of litigation funders out there. They're based in various parts of the world, in America and Europe, all over the place. And it is a huge industry. It is, there are some funders that are managing $8 billion in litigation funds. That's billion with a B. And there are several others who have similar numbers. Now, those really large players are mostly accountable to their own investors. They are in this industry to make money for themselves, by and large, and they could be invested in anything. That litigation funding is for them just something that is there to make some profit. And so they can be helpful, but you need to go in with your eyes open that's who they are. And I think we at Maurice Blackburn and in Claims Funding International regard ourselves as being quite different from those larger funders. We don't have external investors who we are accountable to. We fund cases as a law firm ourselves, and we are fundamentally a law firm rather than a litigation funder. We have existed as a firm for 100 years in Australia. We came out of the trade union movement 100 years ago in Australia and continue to represent unions today as a very important part of what we do. And so our ethos as a firm has always been looking after people who have been wronged by companies and by governments. That's who we act for. And so that approach to how we use the law infuses everything that we do. And we are fundamentally lawyers as well. And so we've run cases before. Nikki and I are actively working on cases as in our own jurisdiction, as well as funding cases of other lawyers. And so we sort of understand that litigation is complicated and it can take different twists and turns, and you can have setbacks along the way, but still have a very successful case. And so we understand that, but I think a lot of the litigation financiers don't necessarily understand that. So again, if you're going to talk to somebody in the litigation funding world, you want to make sure that that you can work with them and that your expectations of them are realistic and that their expectations of you are realistic as well. And so I might leave it there for the moment, because I know we're keen to have some discussion, but very happy to answer questions about litigation funding, and looking forward to hearing from you in the room as well.
Thank you so much, Oscar, for your presentation. Okay, just one thing to reiterate, sorry, una cosa a repetir es que tanto Borislav como Nikki como Oscar, ellos son
They are partners, Roots to Justice. Borislav is a friend and counsel, and Nikki and Oscar. Let's say that they're working in a partnership with Roots to Justice. So this isn't a presentation at the end of it, but we could also explore follow-ups and everything, and any other session that you might need to have more clarity. Now let us go to the Q&A session. They have some questions also that they want to ask you. So we'll make a round of questions, and then they want to learn some things from you as well. So any question? Would somebody like to ask a question and make a comment? Those who haven't spoken today. Adil has spoken a lot, but my question relates to in the organizational ways in Colombia that may participate in summons. What type of documentation do you need? How to formalize and how much time after they are, how much time do we need to?
Let's take a round of preguntas.
Without knowing that when we were making the groups, we said we don't know how to do international financing. What are the steps that we can follow? And this type of training would help us to begin to inquire on this topic. I heard that there's an application, an app. I would like to know about the type of application. If you could give us a roadmap to know and to learn about how to go about with the process. I know that in so many cases, many corporations are created to be able to participate in this type of events. So their social programs are very lengthy. but they've been in service for very short. So greetings to Oscar and Nikki that I've met, and Borislav, who I met. Boris has mentioned that there are some organizations that finance. We've sacredly been working for 3 days, and this is the first time that we have this type of forum in the country with this context and within these teachings. I would like Boris to send to Roots to Justice all the information with these financing funds, because we do have some limitations in Colombia, and the main limitation is information. The second limitation that we encounter are relationship. If we don't have information, we don't have relations or no one to recommend us, it is impossible to find funds. But in addition to the information and that with the relationships, sometimes the formats that we need to fill out are so difficult, and because we have difficulties with respect to the language. They so large foundations in Colombia are the ones that concentrate on this type of cooperation. Good evening and thank you. I have a question. What are the criteria that you consider to decide that a case is relevant or acceptable by you so as to take that case or discard the case?
I think you can perhaps start answering the questions, right? Are you okay with that, or do you want us to do another round? I know your brains are very good as lawyers, but there are limits. Okay.
And maybe combine some of the combine into the answers to several questions. So if I can start, the intermediary organizations that I mentioned, can you? The intermediary organizations that I mentioned are very flexible about the, if I understood the question correctly, was whether you need to have some special legal status to be registered in some official way in order to apply for funding. For governmental donors and for large foundations, in most cases, yes, you have to have some legal status as a charity or registered organization. But for the last category that I mentioned, the intermediary funds, and the three that I mentioned, in most cases, you don't have to be registered officially. And if I combine that with a couple of the other questions, I think that three important ways to capture the attention of a donor. The first is to very clear what you want your final result to be, not to focus so much on I'll file a case here and then I'll go to the government to do this and I will do this and this report, but to say the final outcome of the case is this and this and this. To be very clear about what the people that have suffered the harm will get out of the case, if we're talking about cases or about the project. And also to be quite clear about the risks and difficulties involved, because that gives to the donor an opportunity to suggest additional partnerships, additional capacity. But those three things, I think, if you have them in approaching a donor, I wouldn't say success is guaranteed, but that would be very helpful. In terms of what's available in Colombia, all of these three could be relevant to Colombia. In fact, one of them has a website that has a lot of material in Spanish. Susie, I can send you links to the websites of these ones. Access is really the toughest questions because even in the most flexible ones, they probably have a list of questions that they want to have. You have to have some kind of budget that articulates what you're going to spend the money on. For governmental, they might ask for an enormous Excel file. But for a flexible donor, you just have to say, I need XYZ, and that's how much it costs. The easiest is to, I mean, I don't know if there are intermediaries like this in Colombia, but because of the jargon, the people involved, the forms and so on, the easiest would be to work with someone who knows, or organization, or a person who actually knows all these details to help in approaching them. Success is never guaranteed, but that might be helpful. Let me see if there was another. And finally, one thing that I didn't talk about, because actually I'm not very knowledgeable about it, but it's governmental sources. That's really not for cases, but for communication work, for reports, and so on. There are funding from development agencies and embassies. And the two ones that are most focused on issues related to the behavior of corporations are the Netherlands and Sweden. So it's actually useful to try and get in contact with both development agencies, and in some cases there are more than one, and to embassies from these countries to understand if they have pots of money that could be useful. But I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Borislav. That's really, really helpful. Nikki and Oscar, do you have any additional comments?
I can kick us off and then pass to Oscar again. So I think from the questions that were asked, one of them was, if I start, was about the app that I mentioned. And my understanding, yeah, the question was about the app and maybe also about the application process for litigation funding, but we can talk about both. So the apps are really interesting. I haven't used them yet in my own practice, and Oscar actually was the one that sort of alerted me to them and been doing some deep diving on them. The Eyewitness app, it's eyewitness.global if you do want to go to the website. And they're fascinating. They're being used a lot in Ukraine at the moment, in the conflict in Ukraine. I think if you are interested as lawyers in partnering with, this app, and as I mentioned, there's other ones that are coming out at the moment that I've just been following from afar. On the website, for example, it says partner with us. Then you contact the app and you say, I'm running a case. I would like to facilitate the services of this app. And then you communicate with them through that and see if your case is appropriate for what they're doing. And it's been, my understanding is that there's a lot of sort of war crimes and things like that, but it's expanding into more gathering evidence in other types of cases. So it could be a really interesting resource to explore, particularly for things like environmental damage, human rights abuses in remote communities that evidence might be lost. As an example, I was looking into a case recently for a company's misconduct in the Congo. And by the time we were alerted, or I was alerted in Australia about this mining company's misconduct, it was years later and we couldn't run the case because all the evidence had been lost by that point. So while we thought we could probably make out a number of factors, the evidence on the ground had been lost. So we're really excited about something like this to try to allow those corporate accountability cases with the passage of time to still get off the ground. And then I might flick to Oscar around, there were some questions around the international financing process and the application process and criteria that's looked at, which I think, Oscar, I'll flick to you.
Yeah, thanks, Nikki. And look, there are no set rules, I suppose, other than I think if you're looking for commercial litigation funding, you need to bear in mind, I suppose, that there needs to be, assuming that you do get a damages award, there needs to be room within that compensation amount to recoup the money that the funder has outlaid on the case. For the funder to take some percentage as a profit percentage on that, because it is a commercial arrangement. And then I think most funders that are acting ethically will want to make sure that there is plenty of compensation left over for the victims and for the clients as well. And so I guess the truth of the matter is that tends to be the bigger cases. It tends to be cases where either a few people have very, very large compensation claims, or you have thousands of people who have been affected in the same way by a mining disaster or an environmental harm that has been caused by a company, and all of their cases can be brought together. So, you know, it's all a relative question, I suppose, but generally you will only find that a commercial litigation funder is interested, that it's suitable for that type of litigation funding if there is quite a large damages claim attached to it. And so that's the first threshold point. And then beyond that, you will have, just like you have different donors and different funders giving grants with a different focus and in different parts of the world, there are different funders who focus on different geographies and different parts of the world as well. So it's a matter of it's a matter of finding somebody who is comfortable funding in your part of the world. And I'm sorry, I missed the first question because I didn't have the translation turned on. So I'm not sure, Susie, if we've addressed that one already, or if you want to direct traffic on that.
¿Ha habido alguna pregunta que no ha sido respondida? Yo ahora no recuerdo cuál es la primera. Sí. Okay. He feels that you've answered his question. Well done, Oscar.
Susie, I want to add something. Two additional points. One on the how to approach donors if you're a small or unregistered organization. Most donors love coalitions and networks. So approaching them as a group of organizations, one could be legal, another could be an activist, one could be a community organization, is really a good way to do it. And they're quite happy to give the money to one organization if there's kind of a clarity about how they would be used and who's responsible for what. But coalitions and networks is important. And secondly, when you're using electronic evidence, photographs, videos, and so on, usually the difficulties when you go to the judges, how they assess that evidence. And so about a week ago, a group of organizations from around the world published a guide to judges. That guide is available in Spanish as well. It's called Guía para jueces, juezas y personas responsables de la determinación de los hechos. And it gives advice to judges at all levels how to assess open source evidence. And so that guide could be quite helpful for the judges that you work with as well. Thank you.
Brilliant. Sounds amazing.
And I might just jump in there as well, Borislav, just to follow that comment and Nikki's observations about the app, the Eyewitness app. A key aim of that app is not just making it easy to gather the information, but actually sending it back in real time to the International Bar Association so that it gets recorded there on a server in real time, so that can independently be produced to a court, and it can be said, look, we received this to our servers through our app that has these various security arrangements in place. and verification measures in place. And so that gives you a level of certainty or a level of argument that you can say that, no, these images are real. They were taken in real time. They were taken on this date at this time, according to the phone. So I think it's a really interesting and helpful development as well. And no doubt judges will still need to be educated, but in how to use it. But it's exciting.
Well, una cosa a comentar es que Root to Justice tiene contacto con la American Bar Association, entonces vamos a iniciar una conversación con ellos y también sabíamos de esa aplicación de Eyewitness, entonces creo que podemos intentar facilitar el camino para después abrir la puerta para que todas las organizaciones que están aquí presentes tengan la posibilidad de dialogar con ellos. Bien, then let's go now. We only have 15 more minutes. Let's just have a dialogue. Borislav, Nikki, and Oscar have a few questions. They want to know more about you and your needs. ¿Quieren saber más de vosotros? Okay, so I'll just leave you with the questions.
So happy to kick it off. So I think some of our questions that we were really interested to know in the room was what people's experience has been in the room in terms of locating, accessing, and applying for grants or funding. So we're really keen to hear people's experience and if it's something that you've found easy or difficult, and just, I guess, some feedback for us to understand that and also for other people in the room to share that experience.
Bueno, buenas noches. Yo hago parte de una corporación jurídica, se llama Acción Autónoma de Juristas, y hemos empezado nuestros pinos porque no podemos ya.
In the very first steps, we were created 3 years ago, so we cannot say that we have very significant advances, though they're important. And this experience has helped me a lot in everything. Every speaker during these 3 days has given me a lot of legal tools and information that I feel are going to help me greatly to help as a lawyer all those people that are here and that need a lawyer. And a proof of this is that we were in the south of Cordoba, and one of our concerns was how San Jose de Urube and Cerro Matoso. So here we are, presenting the situation, but learning from you and strengthening those tools that we had, and hearing from tools that we didn't know existed. So this has been very enriching for us. And I feel that I have to inform myself better in order to offer tools to all these leaders that need lawyers that are committed to the cause. Good evening. My name is Jorge Gonzalez. I come from the area of Pasacaballos, in the outskirts of Cartagena, Bolivar. And I represent an organization of entrepreneurs, almost 30 organizations that provide different kinds of services. This experience here, these 3 days, has been excellent, even though it's been hard, too, because the working hours and the tight schedule and all the work, it's been very hard. But what's most important is that it leaves us with a big lesson, but even more, a big commitment. A big commitment to our people, to our communities, to our organizations, and to ourselves. Why? Because today we find ourselves in this scenario where we had a lot of things that we were missing, many things we didn't know. And today, with CAJAD and with Roots to Justice and with the Adil's group, with Adil's team, you have moved us into this new reality where we see that we have to strengthen ourselves much more. But even more important than that is to realize that we need you. Our organizations need to be strengthened because the fight that we have to wage in our territory is very unbalanced. We have many weaknesses regarding methodology, science, professionalism. But I believe that this link that we have today between the community and the organizations, for those of us here, is going to be crucial for us to be much better in the future. Thank you. Good evening, and thank you for those of you that are beginning your day there, right? The experience has been quite interesting, and I want to say that that's how it has to be, Jorge, with much effort and with facilitators that won't let us take a break, because that's what this is all about. It's about laying out an agenda and working on every item, and there are still other elements to be learned and shared. So I feel very well, and I thank God for this space. And I also want to say that in this space, we have managed, at least in a personal level, to understand that this is not my reality only, but also that there are very similar realities, very similar, other realities very different, and to understand that each one of us here are waging a fight in their own territories, in very difficult situations where life is always at stake. This is important because so far as you believe in your territories that you're the only ones, we're wrong. And that won't allow us to be able to coordinate ourselves. One of the big lessons learned here today has been the need to coordinate ourselves, to identify those common things that unite us, those struggles and fights that unite us, to look for an aid or for help in common. Because when you go for that help as a group, you will have more impact on the country. One of the things that I have understood is that it's important to give visibility to our situations, to our problems, because every people is drowning in its own conflict, in its own violation of their rights. Every people is drowning in those. But if I share this with others, we start helping each other based on this sharing. So there's a detail here. We have to be like the hen when she lays an egg. She makes a whole scandal about it. We cannot be like frogs that lay thousands of eggs silently and no one knows. So we need visibility. We have to make noise, and we have to come to spaces like this where we have such a varied group. We have professionals, advisors, playing the role of advisors, and those that are playing the role of leaders in the communities. So it's also important to see how we can help each other to move forward, and this space has been wonderful. And one final point that we did in the last exercise of the legal clinic, and a partner here was saying this, the key thing is that without having talked to each other, when we started the last exercise, we looked at ourselves and we said, yes, we all have the same problem, lack of resources. And we all coincided on that. We all do our work ad honorem. No one here is getting a wage or a salary or an economic gain, because we all have this moral side here. And we have to say it. Colombia has a brave population, and even though the media may say something else, we're brave, we're honest, and we are the majority. Because we realize, and I apologize for taking too much time, we realize that when we first started here, coming from different regions, we saw that we were all doing our work without resources. My colleague told me that she just went to do her work and she was asking for support for transportation and a place to sleep in somebody's house. And we're not talking a town right next to hers. We're talking about distant places at high risk. And with the deals team, we were seeing that we're friends. And when we go for something, well, we go to the different communities, and we're not even recognized for transportation costs. So a deal with your car and your security measures, we can all fit in your car, to see how we can all contribute with something And sometimes there's scarcity for everything, but we do it. And the communities are demanding things from us, reports, coming to the workshop, and managerial things. But we have to recognize the work that all our colleagues do. I'm referring to the people in La Guajira. Just to give an example, and the work that they do facing difficulties all the way from the government entities to the armed illegal groups and the different organizations. We have to face many monsters that are very strong and powerful, and we have no resources. So I think that the pathway starts here to know how to do that work when while facing this daily risk that we have to face, and it makes you tired. But this internal move that I have avoids my giving up and move forward. And I want to thank Cajal for this and Roots to Justice.
Insights and just the last speaker's comment around there being such a lack of resources and everyone operating in their own areas. Is there anything that people in the room, any tips for other lawyers or activists or advocates in the room about resources they've found that have been really useful to share with other people in the room? And you might have done this over the last few days, so it might not be appropriate now, but I think just even after the session ends, having that conversation around, well, there's such a scarcity of resources and we've actually done this and that worked, or we applied for this small grant and we got it, and trying to create those pathways between the different areas.
Buenas noches. Escuchándolos a los tres me lleno de mucha esperanza.
I feel full of hope. I want to thank Gahad and Roots to Justice for this invitation. It's been a very enriching experience. This morning, during the clinic this morning, I was wondering, okay, we've been working on this case for more than 10 years. And we don't see it moving forward. We don't see any results coming from anywhere. And I was wondering, who could we go to for help in, with financial support, with studies or testing? And in listening to Oscar, I feel great because now I know that we can look for funders, we can look for donors elsewhere in other countries. My question is if it is possible in Colombia to find that type of donors that will join our cause, that will be willing to share our losses, and that will truly be interested in our case. Our case is vital. It's of great importance because it has to do with all the damage caused to a whole community. We are 5 municipalities in the same department, but, the total in Colombia, it would be more. But in my case, I'm referring to the south of Bolivar, and I'm talking about the glyphosate spraying, where the number of victims is endless. And this happened more than 10 years ago. So we are working on this case. We don't see any progress. But in hearing you, I feel much better. And I know that you're giving us tools. And I know that there are people like you that are interested in collaborating with us, and that this situation against the environment and all the victims makes you heard due to these situations. Thank you very much. Well, I would like to answer the question that you made as to whether the community or the community council, the Afro peasant from Cañaveral, we have never requested or never applied, at least for help, in our processes. And as to what we have received a lot of, I don't know what word I could use to describe what these organizations offer and the person that is accompanying us. I mean, what Kahar and Sinep and Aida and Sensat are offering us, and Roots to Justice, and all these people. And even though we have known ourselves for 3 days, it feels as if we had known each other for all of our lives, and that is worth more than all the money in the world. When Rosa Maria started to come to our territory, one day she told us something that someone repeated here. I think it was you over there. We used to be happy and we didn't realize it. We don't have money in Cañaverales, the paradise that is in risk of disappearing in La Guajira, the last agricultural source of the Department of La Guajira. Rosa Maria said, you haven't realized that you are millionaires, because when you are in the middle of the ocean, what you see is water, and you don't look beyond what someone that is looking at the things from the outside can see. So in this spirit, I wanted to thank the organizations that have invited us to come here, and I also wanted to invite you to our town, to our territory, invite all of you participating in this event. The only thing that we cannot give you is a transportation ticket, but you can stay there for the rest of your life, and you'll always have food and water and tons of love from our people, because that's what we have to share. We're millionaire in love. We're millionaires in love. On the other hand, there is a piece of news for most of us that have interacted here and exchanged our experiences. We have a very serious environmental conflict with a Turkish transnational company that came with this sort of neo-colonization to destroy our territory. Today, the Ministry of Agriculture has just issued the resolution that we were yearning for. They just called us and told us the resolution has been issued. You have to wait for 5 days for comments on these type of things, and then it will be firm. So we were very much waiting for this. And I think that Rosa Maria wanted to say something. Well, Oscar, I feel very excited because talking about this, I can say that communities are really, really rich. What is happening is that they are empowering, they're making us poor. And this resolution that Oscar talks about is declaring you as an agricultural protected area. And that declaration is for life. It's not, it hasn't been easy, but I think this is a moment to feel the happiness that this brings to us. Of course, we have to wait for 5 days until the minister signs it, but we believe that everything is going to end up very well. I just wanted to say that there is this aspect in relation to all these topics regarding funds and requirements to access them, and it is to be very clear about the criteria and the principles that Oscar was pointing out here. In other words, who are you receiving funds from? Because we have also found communities and processes which basically, because of their needs, they're selling their soul to the devil, because there are many funds that, while they say that they're supporting a specific community, on the other hand, they're also funding the foundations that companies and corporations create in order to be able to enter the different territories and start permeating from the inside. I think that the criteria and the principles that will be established will lead us to being very careful with the resources, because those resources may imply acts of corruption as well. And if they do, that would be the end of the fight. And this is a reality. This model that has made us think that the most important factor is the financial or economic factor is the same model that is leading us to devastating and ridiculous consumption levels. So we have to be very careful about our transparency, about our own internal accountability, and about everything implied in the audit functions and what is implied in the good management of resources, because unfortunately there have also been processes that we have supported somehow. We also look for resources because we also rely on funding, but sometimes there are, let's say, possibilities that do not adjust to what we do. And in that case, what we say is, okay, there is this possibility, apply, and it's terrible when something goes wrong there because you lose the trust and you lose the contact with that funder, etc. So, I'm just making a call to have criteria, the right criteria and principles that will put everything on the right track. CAJAR is 45 years old as an organization, and it has received and performed all the work that they do with the support of agencies and funding from abroad. And a point of attack that they have had has been people wanting to say that we have stolen money and that we represent false victims, and we get visits from the tax authority, and they have never been able to put an end to CAJAR thanks to the transparency and the rigor that they put in their management of resources. So that would be the biggest tip that I could give to you regarding all the processes. Thank you.
I am just thankful to all the institutions, people that share their knowledge and their time with us. I have been working for decades with ethnic communities, peasant communities, and this is the first scenario where I really feel that a series of entities come together to really give us a push. We want to start anew. Well, we are always behind entities trying to find to be heard, to be listened to. But you were kind enough to invite us and to teach us. But what follows? What follows to us as a civil society tomorrow that we all leave? And what follows with you as entities so that we create this brotherhood or sisterhood, and hopefully we can have a common agenda. We can craft an agenda, we could organize it, and at least to move to find ourselves or to join us once a year to meet together and to make this movement grow. Thank you. I would like to, of course, and in line with everyone else, is just to thank you. We are well aware of who is CAJAR. We admire, we don't only know them, but we admire the work they do in terms of human rights from the legal arena. I had no knowledge of Roots to Justice. I didn't know them, but this alliance is wonderful, and the content of these 3 days, the content that you made for us is. I would just like to remember that that you are part of the resistance, and that as part of the resistance of weaving those networks of allies, that for us this is a new network of many, many allies. We already have significant national allies that have been vital in our resistance. But finding new information, as we mentioned in one of the talks about having routes or avenues with funds, especially with strategic litigation, because when we had this, after 4 bills against fracking this year, that the final decision came from the State Council of denying a lawsuit that we had been working on for 2016. We had to think again, what do we do now? And then this international line is one of a line that we would like to explore. So it's great to know and learn about these resources, knowing that there is that support behind to continue, to know exactly who are funding, that we've never explored those routes. So knowing that those resources are available, having the information is vital. But also in line with what Hilda was saying, it's easier to really learn the theory, but when you begin to walk step by step, so in that regard, we will continue, we will require your guidance and your accompaniment to know exactly which doors we need to knock on, and the clicks that we have to do with technology. And lastly, I would like to reflect. I know that we do need cash, we do need money, yes, but we stop doing many things because we don't have that money. But let us not forget that all this, the knowledge that we have on our territory, or the strength. The Adil takes his car and and he goes and he does what he has to do. The nights that we don't sleep because we had to prepare strategies, documents, a work plan. We have all done it without the resources. And if we were to put into money all the efforts of what we've done, there are incredible amounts of resources, especially when I listen to all of you. I was offered 300 million pesos and we didn't receive them because we are committed with our cause and with our fight. That is a value that you can't even, the defense of the territory, there's no money that can compensate that. Yes, but we do need that cash. Yes, of course. But we do have a commitment with our territory, a commitment with our people, a commitment with that to which we feel connected. And there is no money. So let us acknowledge that. Let us be humble, but really to acknowledge what we've done and never lose ourselves in those situations. And Rosa talked about, what that money can do in us. When our colleagues are co-opted, or maybe they deviate in this process when they defend their territory, because it can happen. And to that end, we need to be mature. We need maturity in our collective. And when that resource comes, we need to know how to manage it. Otherwise, if we don't know how to do, then we break processes. That has happened before. So we need to be aware and acknowledge the effort that we've put on. The effort has no financial translation, but we need to assume this with maturity when we find the resources. Thank you. What I would like to say is, Cajal, and now with Roots to Justice, you have shown the capacity to summon events like this that are so significant. Susie, I believe, is stronger than ever. We are the voices of hope of so many people that have nothing, who have left their territory, and many of them have come. And in some case, we have lived of less than $1 or $2 per day. But we have faced or confronted million projects of billions of dollars. This is the first time we're invited to a forum where we're invited and we're asked, what do you need? If we've been able to stop those billion-dollar projects with almost no resources, with no logistics and human resources to confront corporate powers. So my colleagues, let us continue. I thank you. Thank you to Hakahara and to Roots to Justice for this summons. And we will continue. We will find ourselves. We will meet in Cañaverales. We are going to invite Nikki, Oscar, Borislav, and let us review with patience the case of South 32. We have the duty to submit information because we can't leave the communities on their own. If we've been able to achieve this living with less than $1, $2 and confront the Colombian elite, we were able to stop those Del Canal del Dique project. And even thank you, Nikki, Borislav, Oscar, for your support, and we deserve a round of applause. Thank you. I have no words. I'm speechless. It's been beautiful, and we had a closing session. But this has been our thank you to Borislav. It's at least 1 o'clock in the morning, 1 o'clock, 1 at night. Thank you to Nikki and Oscar for being our partners, for supporting us unconditionally. And from Roots to Justice, we have prioritized in this event, together with Kahar, that you could be here. 99%. We wanted you to be here. The rest of the people have contributed voluntarily, but we wanted to commit. We didn't want you to pay a penny because you were our priorities. We've been quite selective in deciding who should be here. We could have invited NGOs and academicians or academics, but we wanted to invite the people that are here, and that's where our money went. And we're very proud of that. So thank you.